The DNA report was definitive. 99.97% probability of paternal relationship. The numbers swam before my eyes as I tried to process what this meant. If this was true, then everything about my life was a lie. Richard Morales wasn't my father, he was my kidnapper. How? I managed to ask. How did they get away with it? Chen opened another folder. The man you know as Richard Morales was involved in a network that facilitated illegal adoptions in the 1980s. He and his then-wife Catherine were unable to have children naturally and were on waiting lists for legitimate adoptions. But Morales was impatient, and he had the money to pay for shortcuts. She showed me a series of documents, financial records, correspondence, medical files. They paid a corrupt clinic in British Columbia to forge adoption papers and create a false paper trail. The plan was to take a child from the Seattle area, drive across the border, and adopt through the clinic. Then return with legitimate-looking paperwork. But why me? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Why that day in the park? You fit their specifications, the older man said bluntly. Female infant, Hispanic features to match Catherine's background, no obvious health problems. The nanny, who we now know was paid to participate, created the distraction. Morales grabbed you during the confusion and drove north immediately. I felt sick. The man I'd called father for 36 years had literally stolen me from my real family. Had planned it, executed it, and then built an entire life on that foundation of theft and lies. What about the nanny? I asked. What about the investigation? The nanny disappeared the same day, Chen explained. The police investigation went cold within weeks. No leads, no witnesses except for vague descriptions that could have fit thousands of men. Dr. Alvarez, your real father, spent his life savings on private investigators, but the trail went dead at the Canadian border. She handed me another photo, this one more recent. It showed a man in his early 70s with graying hair and kind eyes, standing next to a lighthouse on what looked like a rocky coastline. He was holding something small in his hands, a locket or piece of jewelry. He's been waiting for you, Chen said softly. He never remarried, never had other children. He became a marine engineer, specializing in lighthouse preservation and coastal restoration. He said he wanted to make sure there would always be lights to guide lost ships home. The lighthouse connection hit me like a lightning bolt. I reached up unconsciously to touch the small bronze locket I wore around my neck, the one Dad, Richard, had given me for my 16th birthday. He'd said it was a family heirloom, something passed down through generations of Morales women. The locket, I whispered. Chen nodded and opened one final folder. Inside was a photograph of a matching locket, identical to mine except for a small difference in the engraving. Where mine showed half of a lighthouse, this one showed the other half. Your real mother made those before you were born, Chen explained. She died in a car accident when you were 4, but she'd wanted you to have something that would always connect you to home. Dr. Alvarez has been carrying the matching piece for 36 years. I fumbled with the clasp of my necklace, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. When I finally got it open and laid it on the table next to the photograph, the two halves aligned perfectly. It was like a puzzle piece finding its missing match, a circle finally completing itself. He wants to meet you, Chen said. But only if you're ready. He understands this is overwhelming, that your entire world has just been turned upside down. There's no pressure, no expectations. He just wants you to know that he never stopped loving you, never stopped looking for you. I stared at the matched lighthouse pieces and felt something crack open in my chest. All those years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, of never quite fitting the Morales mold, of sensing some fundamental disconnect I could never name, it all suddenly made perfect sense. What's his name? I asked quietly. My real name. Dr. Miguel Alvarez, Chen replied. And your real name is Lena Elena Alvarez. You were named after your grandmother Elena, who helped raise you during your first 6 months. Lena. The name felt foreign on my tongue, but somehow familiar, like a word I'd forgotten from a language I used to speak fluently. Lena Elena Alvarez. Not Eva Morales, daughter of a shipping magnate who'd just publicly disowned her. Lena Alvarez, daughter of a lighthouse engineer who'd spent 4 decades searching for his stolen child. I want to meet him, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. When? Today, if you're ready, Chin said. He's been staying at a hotel downtown, waiting to hear from us. He didn't want to be far away when we made contact. I looked around my apartment, at the life I'd built as Ava Morales. The medical artifacts, the historical prints, the carefully curated existence of a woman who'd never quite known where she belonged. Maybe that was because I'd been living someone else's life all along. Give me an hour to shower and change, I said. Then take me to him. After the lawyers left with promises to return in an hour, I sat in my bathroom staring at myself in the mirror. The face looking back at me was the same one I'd seen every day for 36 years, but now it felt like meeting a stranger. Were those my mother's eyes? My father's stubborn chin? Was I looking at features inherited from people I'd never known, characteristics passed down through generations of Alvarez family members? I thought about Richard. I couldn't call him Dad anymore, not after knowing what I knew. Had he ever looked at me and seen the crime he'd committed? Had there been moments of guilt, flashes of conscience? Or had he convinced himself over the years that he'd rescued me somehow, given me a better life than I would have had with my real family? The shower water was scalding, but I barely felt it. My mind was reeling with questions, with implications I was only beginning to understand. What was Dr. Miguel Alvarez like? Did I have other relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins who might remember the baby who was stolen? What had my real mother been like before she died? Had she looked like me? Had she been artistic, bookish, drawn to history and preservation the way I was? And what about the legal implications? Richard Morales had kidnapped me, forged documents, built his family on a foundation of theft and lies. Would there be criminal charges? Would I have to testify against the man who'd raised me, despite everything? The strangest part was how right it felt, even in the midst of all the shock and confusion. Like some fundamental dissonance in my life had finally been resolved. I'd spent 36 years feeling like an imposter in my own family, like I was playing a role that never quite fit. Now I knew why. I chose a simple blue dress and the lighthouse locket, which I put back on despite everything it now represented. Whatever crimes had brought it to me, it was still the one thing that connected me to my real family, my real history. Chen and her colleagues returned exactly an hour later, professional and prompt. They'd arranged to meet Dr. Alvarez at a small cafe near Pike Place Market, somewhere public, but quiet enough for a private conversation. The ride downtown was surreal. Seattle looked the same as it had yesterday, same gray sky, same rain-slicked streets, same familiar landmarks. But I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes, like the city itself had been transformed by the knowledge that I wasn't who I thought I was. Is he nervous? I asked Chin as we walked toward the cafe. Terrified, she admitted with a small smile. He's been dreaming of this moment for 40 years, but now that it's here, he's afraid you'll hate him for disrupting your life. He's afraid you won't want anything to do with him. That broke something loose in my chest. This man, my real father, was afraid that I would reject him when Richard had just publicly disowned me less than 24 hours ago. The contrast was stark and painful. The cafe was small and warm, filled with the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods. Chin led me to a corner table where a man sat alone, his back to the door. He was staring out the window at Elliott Bay, one hand wrapped around a coffee cup, the other fidgeting with something small, the other half of my locket. Dr. Alvarez? Chin said softly. He turned, and I got my first look at my real father's face. He was exactly as I'd imagined and nothing like I'd expected. Tall and lean with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of deep tan that came from years of working outdoors. His eyes were the same warm brown as mine, but they held a depth of sadness that spoke to decades of loss. When he saw me, those eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. Lena, he whispered, and hearing my real name in his voice was like coming home to a place I'd never been. He stood slowly, as if he were afraid sudden movements might shatter the moment. We faced each other across 3 feet of cafe space and 40 years of separation, 2 strangers who shared DNA and a lifetime of questions. I never stopped looking for you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not for one day. Not for 1 hour. I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat, so I just reached up and unclasped my locket, holding it out to him. He pulled the matching piece from his pocket, and with shaking hands, we fitted them together. The lighthouse image completed itself, two halves making a whole. "Your mother made these," he said softly. "She said that no matter what happened, you'd always be able to find your way home." And then I was crying, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest, from a place that had been hollow and aching for 36 years without me even realizing it. He opened his arms and I fell into them. This stranger who was my father, this man who smelled like salt water and aftershave and something indefinably safe. "I'm sorry," I sobbed into his shoulder. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I didn't know." "Shoo," he murmured, stroking my hair with hands that trembled. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. You were stolen from us, Mija. You survived, and you became this incredible woman, and that's all that matters now." We sat in that cafe for hours while he told me about my real family, my real history. About my mother, Elena, who'd been a teacher and artist, who'd painted watercolor lighthouses and dreamed of travel. About my grandmother, also named Elena, who'd helped care for me during my first months and who'd died 5 years ago, still believing I would come home someday. He told me about his work as a marine engineer, how he'd specialized in lighthouse restoration because it gave him hope that lights could guide lost things home. About the coastal house he'd kept ready for me, with a room that had been waiting for 40 years. About the letters my mother had written before she died, instructions for how to raise a daughter she wouldn't live to see grow up. "She made me promise," he said, pulling a worn photograph from his wallet. It showed a young woman with my face and my stubborn chin, holding a baby who was unmistakably me. "She made me promise that no matter what happened, I would never stop believing you would come home." The investigation moved swiftly once I decided to press charges. Chin had been working with federal authorities for months, building a case against the illegal adoption network that had operated in the Pacific Northwest during the 1980s. My case was the key they needed to finally bring down the remaining players. Richard was arrested the following Wednesday during his regular golf game at the Seattle Country Club. The irony wasn't lost on me. After destroying my life so publicly at a social event, he was taken down in front of his most important peers and business associates. The phones came out again, the cameras flashed, but this time the power dynamic was completely reversed. I watched the news coverage from Miguel's hotel room, where I'd been staying while I figured out what came next. Seeing Richard in handcuffs was surreal, like watching a movie of someone else's life. The man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to sail and helped with homework and told me bedtime stories, led away in federal custody for kidnapping and fraud. "How do you feel?" Miguel asked gently. He'd been giving me space to process everything, never pushing for more emotional connection than I was ready for. "Empty," I admitted. I thought I'd feel vindicated or triumphant, but I just feel empty. He nodded like he understood. Revenge rarely feels the way we think it will. Justice is necessary, but it doesn't undo the pain. The media coverage was intense, but different from the humiliation I'd experienced at the gala. Now I was the victim, the stolen child finally returned home. Reporters wanted to know how it felt to discover my entire life was a lie, whether I blamed myself for not knowing sooner, what I planned to do next. I gave one interview, to a local news station, partly to set the record straight and partly to send a message to Richard and anyone who might still support him. "I want people to understand that I'm not angry about being loved," I said, looking directly into the camera. Catherine Morales, the woman I thought was my mother, loved me genuinely. Even Richard showed me affection and care for many years. But love built on stolen foundation isn't real love, it's possession. And when love becomes possession, it always ends in destruction. The interviewer asked if I forgave Richard, if I understood why he did what he did. "I understand desperation," I said carefully. "I understand wanting a child so badly that you might make terrible choices. But I don't understand stealing someone else's baby and then spending 40 years letting that child's real father search and suffer and wonder. I don't understand building your entire family on that foundation of cruelty and then having the audacity to lecture about loyalty and respect." Within days of Richard's arrest, other victims started coming forward. Families who'd lost children in the 1980s, who'd been told their cases were cold, who'd given up hope of ever seeing their stolen babies again. The investigation expanded to include dozens of cases across multiple states. Marcus and Elena, my supposed siblings, released a statement through their lawyers expressing shock and support for my ordeal. But they also made it clear that they intended to distance themselves from both Richard and me, protecting their own interests and reputations. I couldn't blame them. In their position, I might have done the same thing. Vivian filed for divorce immediately, claiming she'd had no knowledge of Richard's crimes. Whether that was true or not, she was cutting ties as quickly as possible, taking whatever settlement she could get before the legal system froze all of Richard's assets. Miguel and I drove up to his coastal house on a gray Saturday morning 2 weeks after our first meeting. The Pacific Northwest coastline stretched endlessly in both directions, rocky beaches and tide pools and forests that came right down to the water's edge. The house was a modest craftsman-style bungalow perched on a bluff overlooking the Sound, with a perfect view of the lighthouse on the small island a mile offshore. It looked exactly like the artwork I'd been drawn to my entire life, like a place I'd been homesick for without knowing it existed. "This is where you would have grown up," Miguel said as we stood on the front porch, salt air whipping our hair around our faces. "Your mother chose this spot because she said she wanted you to wake up every morning seeing the lighthouse, knowing you were home." Inside, the house was full of light and warmth, with exposed beams and a stone fireplace and windows that framed the ocean like living paintings. But it was the small bedroom at the end of the hall that broke my heart completely. It was clearly meant for a child, with pale yellow walls and white furniture and shelves lined with children's books. But it had been kept pristine, untouched, like a shrine to the daughter who never came home. On the dresser sat a wooden box with my name carved into the lid, Lena Elena Alvarez. "I couldn't change it," Miguel said quietly from the doorway. "I kept thinking you'd walk through that door any day, and I wanted everything to be ready." Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, written in a woman's careful handwriting. The return address said Elena Alvarez, and the dates spanned from 1989 to 1991, when my real mother died. "She wrote them while she was sick," Miguel explained. "Instructions for raising you, advice for different stages of your life, things she wanted you to know. She made me promise to save them until you came home." I opened the first letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Lena, if you are reading this, then you have finally come home to us. I am writing this while you are still missing, while your father, and I still believe you will walk through our door any day now. By the time you read this, I will probably be gone. The doctors have given me 2 years at most, but I wanted to leave you something of myself, something to help guide you through the years I won't be here to see." The letters covered everything: advice about friendships and heartbreak, thoughts on career and purpose, family stories and traditions I'd never known existed. My mother had essentially raised me through those letters, providing the guidance she couldn't give in person. One letter, dated just months before her death, contained a line that hit me like lightning. "Remember that your life doesn't begin with what was stolen from you. It begins with what you choose to rebuild." Miguel cooked dinner while I read letter after letter, learning about the woman who'd given birth to me and the life I'd missed. Elena Alvarez had been an art teacher who specialized in watercolor seascapes. She'd met Miguel at a lighthouse preservation conference, bonding over their shared love of coastal history. They'd planned to travel the world together, visiting famous lighthouses and documenting their stories. "She would have loved what you do," Miguel said as we ate fresh salmon and watched the sunset paint the water orange and pink. Preserving history, protecting artifacts that tell stories about the past. She always said the most important job in the world was keeping memory alive. After dinner, we sat on the back deck with cups of coffee, watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the darkening water. The rhythm was hypnotic, steady, and reliable, a heartbeat of light in the gathering darkness. "What happens now?" I asked. "With Richard, with the investigation, with everything?" Miguel was quiet for a long moment. "That's up to you, Mija. You can choose how much of your old life you want to keep, how much of your new life you want to embrace. You can be Ava or Lena or someone entirely new." "And you?" I asked. "What do you want?" He smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him. I want whatever makes you happy. I've had 40 years to learn that love isn't about possessing someone or controlling their choices. It's about creating space for them to become who they're meant to be. The contrast with Richard's version of fatherhood was stark and painful. Where Richard had demanded compliance and conformity, Miguel offered acceptance and support. Where Richard had used love as a weapon of control, Miguel offered it as a gift with no strings attached. The trial began 6 months later, in the spring when the coastal garden Miguel had planted for me was finally blooming. I'd moved into the Lighthouse house permanently by then, leaving my Capitol Hill apartment and my old life behind. I kept my job at the hospital. No one there cared about my family drama as long as I continued to do good work, but everything else changed. I legally changed my name back to Lena Elena Alvarez. I started therapy to process the trauma of discovering my entire childhood was built on lies. I began exploring my Hispanic heritage, learning Spanish and cooking traditional foods, and connecting with distant relatives who welcomed me home with tears and celebration. Most importantly, I started building a new relationship with Miguel based on honesty and choice rather than obligation and control. We took long walks on the beach, worked together in the garden, and slowly, carefully, learned how to be father and daughter. The courthouse was packed the day I testified against Richard. Media attention had been intense throughout the investigation, with the case becoming a symbol of international adoption fraud and family corruption. I wore a simple black dress and the lighthouse locket, now restored to its original purpose as a symbol of finding home. Richard looked older, diminished somehow, in his defendant's chair. Prison had not been kind to him. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by a standard orange jumpsuit. His commanding presence had withered into something desperate and grasping. When I took the stand, our eyes met for the first time since that terrible night at the gala. I expected to feel hatred or fear or some other powerful emotion. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. This man had stolen 4 decades from my real father, had built his entire family on a foundation of crime and lies, and for what? So he could disown me publicly the moment I failed to meet his standards? Miss Alvarez, the prosecutor said, using my real name deliberately, please tell the court about your experience growing up as the victim of kidnapping. I looked out at the gallery, where Miguel sat in the front row, offering me strength with his presence. Behind him were other families, other victims of the adoption fraud network, people who'd been waiting decades for justice. I want to be clear about something, I said, my voice steady and strong. For most of my childhood, I believed I was loved. The woman I thought was my mother, Catherine Morales, showed me genuine affection and care. Even Richard had moments of what seemed like real parental love. Richard's defense attorney perked up, probably thinking I was about to provide character testimony in his favor. But I continued that love was built on a foundation of theft and lies. And when love is possessive rather than liberating, when it demands conformity rather than celebrating individuality, it eventually reveals its true nature. I looked directly at Richard then, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. You didn't give me life, Mr. Morales. You stole it. You stole my first 6 months with my real family. You stole my mother's death from me. I never got to say goodbye to Elena Alvarez because I didn't even know she existed. You stole my father's right to raise his daughter, and you stole my right to know my real heritage, my real name, my real self. Richard's face was flushed, his hands clenched in his lap. His defense attorney was writing furiously, probably trying to figure out how to spin this testimony in his favor. But most of all, I said, my voice growing stronger, you stole the truth. You taught me that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that I was only valuable as long as I met your standards. And when I failed to be the perfect daughter you thought you'd purchased, you discarded me as publicly and cruelly as possible. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling. I survived your version of love, I said finally. But I'm not grateful for it. Real love doesn't need to be stolen. Real love doesn't demand performance. Real love doesn't end with public humiliation and rejection. I looked back at Miguel, whose eyes were bright with tears of pride and pain. Real love waits 40 years for a stolen daughter to come home, and then gives her the space to choose her own future. The prosecution rested their case after my testimony, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Richard Morales was convicted on all counts: kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. I felt no satisfaction watching him led away in shackles. There was no moment of triumph, no sense that justice had healed the wounds he'd inflicted. There was just closure, the final page turning on a chapter of my life that had ended the night he disowned me in front of 300 witnesses. Miguel and I drove home in comfortable silence, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the water as we approached our house on the bluff. Our house. The words still felt new and strange and wonderful. "How do you feel?" he asked as we sat on the back deck with glasses of wine, the same question he'd asked after Richard's arrest. "Different," I said after thinking about it. "Not empty this time. Different." He nodded and waited for me to continue, a skill he'd mastered during our months of learning to be family. "I think I understand now what your Elena meant about life, beginning with what you choose to rebuild rather than what was stolen," I said. For 36 years, I was trying to fit into a life that was never really mine. Now I get to build something real. Miguel raised his glass. "To rebuilding," he said. "To coming home," I replied. We sat there as the lighthouse beam painted paths across the dark water, two halves of a family finally made whole again. In the morning, I would return to my work preserving medical history, but now it felt like more than just a job. I was keeping memory alive, protecting stories that might otherwise be lost. I was doing what Elena Alvarez had taught me through her letters, honoring the past while building the future. I started a foundation 6 months after the trial, using money from a settlement Richard's insurance company paid to avoid further litigation. The Lighthouse Foundation helps families reunite with children lost to illegal adoptions and trafficking. We provide legal assistance, investigative resources, and emotional support for families navigating the complex process of finding their missing pieces. Miguel serves on the board, along with Dr. Martinez from the hospital. Yes, the same Dr. Martinez whose innocent coffee meetings with me had triggered Richard's final destructive act. It turned out he was an expert in trauma counseling as well as emergency medicine, and his divorce had been finalized months before Richard's paranoid accusations destroyed my old life. Our relationship developed slowly, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than the secrets and manipulation that had defined my previous existence. He understood better than most what it meant to rebuild your life from the ground up. His own marriage had ended because his ex-wife couldn't accept his decision to work with underserved populations rather than pursue more lucrative private practice opportunities. The foundation headquarters occupy a renovated building in downtown Seattle, with large windows overlooking Elliott Bay and vintage medical equipment that I restored as decorative elements. We call our main conference room Elena's room and display her lighthouse paintings on the walls. But my favorite space is my personal office, where I keep the mahogany display case I rescued from Richard's estate auction. The same case that had held medical artifacts the night he destroyed my life now holds Elena's letters, arranged chronologically so visitors can see the progression of a mother's love across years of separation and hope. The centerpiece of the display is the reunited lighthouse locket, both halves finally together in a small velvet-lined compartment. Below it, a small placard reads, "Your life doesn't begin with what was stolen. It starts with what you choose to rebuild." Elena Alvarez, 1991. Dr. Martinez, David, proposed on the beach below the lighthouse house at sunset, with Miguel's enthusiastic blessing. The engagement ring he offered was a simple band with a small lighthouse engraved on the setting, designed by a local artist who'd heard our story and wanted to contribute to our happy ending. We married the following spring in the garden Miguel had planted for me, surrounded by families the foundation had helped reunite and friends who'd become chosen family. Miguel walked me down the aisle, but instead of giving me away, he spoke words Elena had written in one of her letters. "Today you choose your future, Mija. Today you become exactly who you were meant to be." The ceremony was small and perfect, with lighthouse lanterns strung between the trees and Elena's watercolor seascapes displayed on easels around the garden. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to build a life based on truth and choice, and the kind of love that creates space for growth rather than demanding conformity. Marcus and Elena, my former siblings, didn't attend, which was their choice and probably for the best. They'd built their own lives around the Morales legacy and couldn't afford to associate with the scandal I represented. I didn't blame them, but I didn't miss them either. Family, I'd learned, was about more than shared DNA or legal documents. My real family now included Miguel, David, the extended Alvarez relatives who'd welcomed me home with joy and celebration, and the community of survivors and supporters who'd grown up around the Foundation's work. It was chosen family, built on love and respect rather than obligation and control. Richard died in prison 18 months into his sentence, of a heart attack brought on by the stress of incarceration and the collapse of his empire. I learned about it from a news report rather than any personal notification. I'd legally changed my name and contact information, cutting all ties to my former life. I felt sad when I heard the news, but not devastated. The man who'd raised me had died years ago, the night he chose public humiliation over private conversation, performance over relationship, control over love. The person who died in prison was someone I'd never really known, a criminal who'd built his life on theft and lies. Miguel and I attended his funeral, not to mourn Richard, but to say goodbye to the complicated emotions his death brought up. We stood at the back of the mostly empty chapel. Most of his former associates had distanced themselves after the conviction, and I tried to find some peace with the whole terrible story. "Are you okay?" Miguel asked quietly as we watched the simple casket being wheeled out for burial. "I'm free," I said, realizing it was true. For the first time in my life, I'm completely free. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. David and I had a daughter, Sophia Elena, named for both of the strong women who'd shaped my story. Miguel was a devoted grandfather, teaching Sophia to identify different types of lighthouses and telling her stories about her grandmother Elena's paintings. Sophia grew up knowing her full history, the painful parts as well as the beautiful ones. We never hid the truth about how Mama had been stolen as a baby, how Abuelo Miguel had searched for 40 years, how our family had been broken and rebuilt stronger than before. "Were you sad when you found out your whole life was pretend?" Sophia asked one evening when she was 7, as we sat on the deck watching the lighthouse beam paint patterns on the water. "I was sad about the lying," I told her honestly. "But I wasn't sad about finding out who I really was. Sometimes the best discoveries come from the most painful revelations." She nodded seriously, processing this the way children do, accepting complexity as a natural part of life. "I'm glad you found Abuelo," she said finally. "And I'm glad he never stopped looking for you." "Me too, Mija," I said, using the endearment Miguel had taught me. "Me too." The foundation continued to grow, helping dozens of families reconnect with stolen children and providing support for survivors of illegal adoption networks. We expanded our services to include counseling, legal advocacy, and educational programs about trafficking and exploitation. I spoke at conferences around the country, sharing my story not for the drama of it, but for the hope it represented. That it was possible to rebuild after devastating betrayal. That families could heal from unimaginable trauma. That love built on truth was infinitely stronger than possession built on lies. The most meaningful speaking engagement was at a conference for medical archivists, where I talked about the connection between preserving historical artifacts and preserving family memory. I displayed some of Elena's paintings and talked about how art and artifacts serve as bridges between past and present, helping us understand who we are and where we come from. "Every artifact tells a story," I told the audience. "Every preserved document, every restored photograph, every carefully maintained family heirloom carries forward someone's truth." In my case, a simple lighthouse locket preserved the story of a love that transcended 40 years of separation. After the presentation, a young archivist approached me with tears in her eyes. "I was adopted as a baby," she said quietly. "Legitimately, through legal channels, but I've always wondered about my birth family. Your story gives me hope that it's never too late to find missing pieces of yourself. That conversation led to the Foundation's newest initiative, a program helping adoptees and birth families navigate reunion when both parties want connection. Not every story ended like mine, with clear villains and dramatic courtroom justice, but every story deserved respect and support. David often joined me at speaking events, adding his perspective as someone who'd fallen in love with a woman rebuilding her entire identity. He talked about the privilege of witnessing someone discover their authentic self and the beauty of building a relationship based on choice rather than circumstance. I didn't fall in love with Eva Morales, he would say. I fell in love with Lena Alvarez as she was becoming herself. That's a very different thing than loving someone for who you think they should be. On the 10th anniversary of my reunion with Miguel, we threw a party in the Lighthouse Garden. Families we'd helped through the Foundation attended, along with investigators and attorneys and counselors who'd made our work possible. Sophia, now a precocious 10-year-old, gave a speech about the importance of family traditions and keeping lighthouse lockets clean. As the sun set and the party wound down, Miguel and I walked down to the beach where we'd taken so many conversations over the years. The lighthouse beam swept across the water in its eternal rhythm, and I thought about Elena's words about lights guiding lost ships home. Do you ever regret it? Miguel asked. The upheaval, the publicity, the loss of your former life? I considered the question seriously. There had been difficult moments, therapy sessions that left me raw and shaken, legal proceedings that felt like public dissection, the ongoing work of rebuilding relationships and trust. But regret? Never, I said firmly. Every painful step led me here, to this life, to this family, to this work. I wouldn't trade any of it. Miguel smiled and squeezed my hand. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become. As we walked back up to the house, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. It had started with public humiliation and betrayal, with the collapse of everything I thought I knew about myself. But it had led to authentic love, meaningful work, and the kind of family that celebrated rather than constrained. Richard Morales had stolen my first 6 months and shaped my next 36 years through lies and manipulation. But in the end, his cruelty had freed me to discover who I really was and who I was meant to become. I was Lena Elena Alvarez, daughter of Miguel and Elena, wife to David, mother to Sophia, and founder of an organization that helped other stolen children find their way home. I was a keeper of stories, a preserver of truth, a lighthouse in my own small way for people lost in the darkness of family trauma and separation. My life hadn't begun with what was stolen from me. It had begun with what I chose to rebuild. And what I'd rebuilt was more beautiful, more authentic, and more meaningful than anything Richard's version of fatherhood could ever have provided. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, steady and eternal, guiding lost ships toward home. Just as Elena had painted in her watercolors, just as Miguel had maintained through 40 years of searching, just as I would continue to do through my work with the Foundation. Some lights are worth keeping burning, no matter how long the darkness lasts. And that, in the end, was the real lesson of my story. Not the dramatic courtroom justice or the media attention or even the happy ending with Miguel and David and Sophia. The real lesson was that authentic love creates light that can guide us home, even when we've been lost so long we forgot where home was supposed to be. Richard's version of love had been possession, control, conditional approval that could be withdrawn the moment I failed to meet his standards. But Miguel's love and Elena's love, carried forward through her letters, was different. It was patient and persistent and unconditional. It created space for me to become myself rather than demanding I conform to someone else's expectations. That was the love I tried to embody in my work with the Foundation, in my marriage to David, in raising Sophia. Love that illuminated rather than controlled, that guided rather than demanded, that celebrated authenticity rather than performance. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're carrying a quiet truth, if you're feeling lost or stolen or disconnected from your authentic self, may your lighthouse lead you home. May you find the courage to rebuild rather than just survive. May you discover that your life doesn't begin with what was stolen from you, but with what you choose to create from the pieces that remain. Sometimes the most beautiful lighthouses are built on the rockiest shores, standing strong not despite the storms, but because of them. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone else, but about finding yourself. And sometimes coming home means leaving everything you thought you knew behind and choosing truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, rebuilding over resentment. I am Lena Elena Alvarez, and this is my story of coming home.